Now whatever you'll do, it will be
live. ठीक है.
ठीक है, मैं जाता हूँ. ठीक है.
Thank you.
इसको
पिए हो क्या? पिए हो क्या?
क्या स्मेल आ रही है? ये बहुत हेक्टिक था ना काम. बाय बाय.
Okay, let's see if that's any better.
Yeah, I can hear you fine.
You hear me fine now? Okay, good.
Yeah.
Just one.
Is it the same for everyone? Everyone's fine, right? Samit, you can hear fine?
Yep.
So you
Is the
were you
volume
traveling?
okay? Testing one, two.
Fine, Vasundhara. Yeah.
Okay. Were you traveling out of Mexico somewhere?
I was traveling from the province where I live, Chiapas, to the capital, Mexico City. I just arrived last night.
Oh, okay. All right.
So I'm actually in a hotel room with a photograph of my office behind me. That's why I get back. I just noticed.
Can do with technology nowadays.
So we're all set in a couple of minutes.
Yeah.
To start.
Just wait for a few
Check it then. Okay.
Are you teaching now? Is it semester time?
Yes, yes, we just started a new master's program for people from farmer organizations from all over Latin America, and so we're in the first trimester of this new master's program.
Well, that sounds very exciting.
Yes, indeed. It was very difficult to get it through all the university bureaucracy and everything, since it's a non-traditional audience, non-conventional. But we're really excited.
That's great. And so it's based in Ecosur?
Yes, at Ecosur, together with SOCLA, which is the Latin American Scientific Society for Agriculture, and then also with Via Campesina in Latin America.
Oh. But so the classes take place in Chiapas, or they try to travel?
Yeah.
Okay, nice. Great. Maybe we'll start in. I know we want to sort of stick to time, but maybe we'll start in just a minute, because we're having it sort of a little outside of our workplace, so just give people time to join in.
I'm going to see if I can share my presentation. I'm just going to test, see if that works.
Yeah.
Okay, you can see it now, no problem?
It's just taking a moment, but I think it's coming. Yeah.
Yes? Okay.
Yes.
Let me just advance one. You can still see it?
Yes.
Okay. All right. So it's a
Okay.
little slow to load each one, but it loads.
Yeah, I think it's the connection also in between. It was seeming a bit off, but now your picture also seems clearer.
Okay, good.
Ananda, you can make it live, and then once you tell me that it's done, then we can start.
Yeah, it is live.
Okay. So I guess we'll start, and people can sort of keep joining in as they come along. So welcome, Peter. We're really happy to have you as part of our lecture series, and very excited to hear what you have to say and to tell us. Just to very briefly and quickly introduce Peter to the audience. Peter is based in Mexico. He's based in the state of Chiapas in the southeast of Mexico, at El Colegio de la Frontera Sur, which is based in Chiapas. And he's been working, academically on the one hand on questions of land, territory, the very basic question of the politics of how food is grown. But alongside that, and he's published very widely, written a lot of articles,
Hello.
a lot of books, especially
हाँ, तो
increasingly
वहाँ
on
पे
the theme of
लाइव स्ट्रीम में
agroecology, but he's
वीडियो
also
नहीं दिखा
someone
रहा है.
who's worked very actively with
नहीं
movements.
पता.
He's worked on
हाँ,
peasant,
आजा
small farmer and indigenous people's movements, but also worked with these movements. He's worked with La Via Campesina, which is a global peasant and family farm movement,
ये देखो
including with movements
ऐसा आ रहा है
which
YouTube लाइव
have been
स्ट्रीम.
key to the formation and establishment of Via Campesina, like MSC
ये
in
करो,
Brazil, which is
एक्टिवेट
the
करो.
land test workers
क्या
movement.
एक्टिवेट करो?
ये
So
नेट
he's
का है.
someone, while he's
नेट है ना?
an
वो बात
academic
नहीं है, वो
who's
यहाँ पे
research
आपको
on these questions of land and
समझा
of the
नहीं.
politics of food production. He's also continuously remained engaged, and his research has also sort of evolved in conversation and through his political engagement with movements. And like he was just saying that they're currently in the process of having launched, and in the midst of the first course that they've actually put together, Agroecology, where participants from different farmer movements, are the students. So they've sort of been engaging in also a lot of these very interesting pedagogical as well as research processes, right, of how we build and construct knowledge and how we engage with the themes around which we study and research. And so, I think this is a great opportunity for us that this online system has allowed us to do, possibilities that we weren't exploring, even though they were always there. So thanks, Peter. A very warm welcome. And hand it over to you. So I guess about 30, 35 to 40 minutes you can take, and then we'll open it up for questions and discussion.
Okay, thank you very much. It's really a great pleasure to be here with everybody. It's not often that one gets to do a webinar halfway across the world. It happens once in a while, but as you say, it's one of the advantages we have in the current difficult situation around the world. So I'm going to talk about agroecology, and I'll say what that is in a moment. But I want to position it as a challenge from the grassroots and also from the scientists and academics and researchers. But it's just important to locate ourselves right now in what our current situation is with the food system. But I first want to just define agroecology. On the academic side, it's known as the scientific basis of sustainable agriculture, understanding the ecological interactions within any kind of a farming system. So it's the inter and transdisciplinary science of how agricultural systems work, and that means both natural and social sciences, and also provides a scientific basis for the design of more sustainable systems. But it's not only an academic science, it also is a set of agricultural farming practices that allow farming in a way in ways that are more sustainable without chemicals or GMOs. And it's also a social movement, a global social movement of peasants, small farmers, family farmers, consumers, environmentalists, human rights organizations, researchers, NGOs, and many others who are trying to transform our agri-food system into something that's more sustainable and that provides for better livelihoods for rural people, protects the rural environment, and provides healthier food for people. Now, before I talk about some of the political dimensions of our current food system, I'd like to mention the context of COVID-19 and previous epidemics or pandemics like swine flu, avian flu, and others, and foodborne diseases like E. coli, salmonella, etc. These illnesses and diseases, epidemics and pandemics, are largely driven by the food system. So if we think about particularly industrial livestock production under confinement, that creates overcrowding conditions for animals. They're given antibiotics in extreme dosage, which creates illnesses that jump to the human population, antibiotic resistant, like E. coli or salmonella, and also provides the perfect basis for the evolution of new viruses. And it's quite clear that avian flu and swine flu came from industrial livestock production. And in terms of the main hypotheses as to the origin of COVID or SARS-CoV-19, it also is related to the industrial livestock system. Either the livestock feed industry, in which large monoculture production of maize or soybeans for animal feed is cutting down the forest around the world and pushing wildlife into closer proximity to human habitation, making it more likely that viruses will jump from wild populations into human populations. And on the other hand, the hypothesis, and so that's one of the hypotheses on the origin of COVID, that may have jumped, for example, from bats or other wild animals into human population. That would be driven, then the driver is the livestock feed industry. The other hypothesis is that it actually came from wild meat sold in the wet market in Wuhan, China. But it turns out that so-called wild meat now has also been industrialized. Animals like pangolins and others are now produced by the same global livestock companies that factory farm chickens, that factory farm pigs, that factory farm cattle. And so if it was produced, if it jumped to the human population from those wild animals, very likely it was also the same overcrowding industrial agri-food system that's producing so-called wild meat. What I'm saying is that most of these illnesses are driven by the corporate agri-food system, as is deforestation on a global level, as is global warming. The corporate long-distance transport food system is widely believed to be responsible from 34 to 64% of all global greenhouse gas emissions. And the social context and environmental context in rural areas around the world is that the countryside is composed of territories that are in dispute, being disputed between local people with their local needs and also the local environment, and global markets with global needs that seize and steal and rob and have various other ways to acquire the land of poor people, in which then unsustainable large-scale monoculture, chemical-intensive production practices take place, and armed security or police or army are needed to keep the peasants who are driven off the land from recolonizing that land, and that produces the very high level of conflictivity and social devastation that we have in rural areas around the world and all continents. The kind of agriculture that we have in rural areas not only affects people, but also affects biodiversity. So for example, if we have a mosaic of small farmer peasant agriculture, it sustains a much higher level of biodiversity in rural areas than if we have an industrial monoculture, as we see below. So really what we have is a global dispute between what we call the industrial food chain versus what might be called the peasant food web. Now, a lot of people will say we need the industrial food chain because otherwise we couldn't produce enough food to feed everybody who's now living in urban areas around the world. But in fact, if we look at the actual statistics of all food that is consumed by human beings on planet Earth today, even though we might say economically and financially the corporate agri-food system is dominant, but in fact 70% of the food that humanity currently consumes comes from small-scale producers of food, peasants, artisanal fisher folk, hunters and gatherers, nomadic pastoralists, etc. And in fact, those small-scale producers only have access to 25% of the arable land. 75% is in the hands of the corporate food chain. But the corporate food chain only produces 30% of the food we eat, whereas peasants and similar small-scale producers at only 25% of the land are actually producing 70% of our food. So we could say that the peasant food web is currently feeding humanity, and there's no reason to think that it couldn't in the future. And there's no reason to think that the corporate food system would ever be able to feed the majority of people or produce the majority of our food. We can take a typical case of Brazil, where peasant and family farmers only get 14% of farm loans and credit, only have access to 24% of farmland, yet they produce 70% of total food production and generate 74% of total agricultural employment. Agribusiness gets almost all the financing, has almost all the land, yet only produces 30% of food. So that's a one-country case that illustrates this more global phenomenon that the peasant food web actually is feeding people today. Now, I've done a lot of research over the years, and some of the things that I found are that around the world, wherever data is available from agricultural censuses, and not every country collects this kind of data, but we find that small farms produce much more per hectare or per unit area than large farms. So there's a myth that agribusiness monoculture, industrial monoculture is highly productive, but it's not. In fact, complex, diverse peasant systems produce much more per unit area because they're not monocultures. Peasants are producing 17, 18, 19, 20, 30 different crops and animal species on the same hectare, whereas an industrial monoculture might be just soybeans or just sugarcane. And even though it might have a high yield of that crop, it's producing nothing else. And along the same vein, so-called high-input industrial agriculture, otherwise known as the Green Revolution, that means intensive production in monoculture with chemical fertilizer, chemical pesticide, commercial seeds, irrigation, where we look at it around the world, and I just put one example here from Cuba, but the graphs are similar anywhere. And this, when this model, this intensive model comes in, you get maybe a decade or a decade and a half of increasing productivity. Then productivity levels off, and then in fact begins to decline. And this is taking place around the world in industrial ag or Green Revolution lead areas. Yields are leveling and declining because this kind of agriculture is not sustainable. It compacts the soil, it erodes the soil, it kills biodiversity, there's no life left in the soil, there are no natural enemies to have natural control of pests, pests become resistant to pesticides, and so the productivity gains of this kind of industrial model are illusory and temporary, and really the sustainable way to increase production is through diversified peasant and what we call agroecological farming systems. There's some data I collected in Cuba that where we ranked farms from less agroecological, i.e. more monoculture, towards more agroecological, i.e. more complex, and using less or no pesticide, and we found that total production per unit of area and per unit of labor or per worker was much higher the more agroecological and complex the farming system was. And the more simple industrial ag systems were less productive, both in terms of land as an input and in terms of labor as an input. This goes contrary to many of the cherished myths that the industrial food system and its ideological control over universities and knowledge production has given us these myths that they're necessary, that they're more productive, that they're sustainable. None of it is supported by the actual data. The actual data shows the contrary. Now, as I'm in addition to an academic, I'm a social movement activist. I spent 15 years as part of the technical team of the Operative Secretariat of La Via Campesina, which are farmer and peasant and farm worker and indigenous peoples movements around the world. We're in all continents. After the world's largest religions, La Via Campesina is the largest movement of human beings on Earth, about 200 million families around the world, including quite a few families in India, Latin America, the rest of Asia, Africa, Europe, the Middle East. And this global social movement made up of farmer organizations, what I symbolize in these images on the top is a political struggle against the bad policies around the world that hurt small farmers and favor agribusiness. And on the lower part, how peasants and small farmers through La Via Campesina and organized spaces are trying to take back control over their farming systems and stop using the industrial chemical commercial seed model and go back to a combination of more traditional practices along with more new innovative agroecology, ecological farming practices. So it's a global social movement. It's everywhere in the world. I know India just went through some major farmer protests, and the Via Campesina organizations, who don't necessarily make up the majority of farmer organizations in India, but participated along with all of the rest of them. And La Via Campesina for a long time has put forth food sovereignty as a paradigm to substitute the somewhat expired food security paradigm. Food security is what we hear all the time. It's what governments talk about. It's what large NGOs talk about. It's what multilateral agencies like FAO. It's what the private sector talks about. And the food security, of course, has some good elements. It says that everybody should have access to enough food every day. Unfortunately, and this is the weakness and the way that this food security concept actually acts as a Trojan horse for industrial corporate agriculture, is it doesn't say how the food that everybody should have access to is produced. It doesn't say where it's produced, and it doesn't say by whom it's produced. And it turns out, from the point of view of La Via Campesina as a farmer social movement, and I think consumer movements should agree with this, it does matter how, where, and by whom our food is produced. So, for example, it's not the same if we have food that's produced in an industrial monoculture using GMOs and with residues of highly toxic pesticides, as if that food is produced ecologically and is essentially organic. Organic as a market term, agroecologically has to do with the way that you can produce organic food. So it does matter how it's produced. It does matter where it's produced. Is it produced locally, or is it shipped halfway around the world with incredible greenhouse gas emissions that are totally unnecessary from long distance transport? So it's not the same if it's produced somewhere else as if it's produced locally. And by who? Is it produced by a global corporation, or is it produced by local peasant and farm families? And so food sovereignty says that we need to transform the food system into a more localized, more ecological, and more small farmer system. That way we can produce actually more food, we can produce healthier food, we can reduce the production of new diseases and pandemics, we can reduce deforestation, we can reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and essentially we would have a food system that's better for everybody except for the 1% who may be shareholders in global agri-food corporations. They would be the only losers if this social struggle to move from a food security model to a food sovereignty model were successful. And so within this larger paradigm of food sovereignty, Via Campesina and other social movements say that agroecology is a key pillar. Peasant and family farm-based agroecology has many advantages compared to industrial agriculture. Among them, and I've already mentioned most of them, healthy food for local people, food sovereignty, better rural livelihoods, more compatible with rural cultures, more like traditional agriculture based on more traditional knowledge, more resilient to climate and other shocks, lower greenhouse gas emissions, lower probability of emergence diseases, lower production costs, less indebtedness for farmers, means better stewardship of productive resources like soil and biodiversity, and for farmer families, greater autonomy, less external dependence. They will no longer depend on the always rising cost of chemical fertilizer, chemical pesticide, and commercial seeds. So in other words, they're autonomous from those market forces to the extent that their production is agroecological. Now, agroecology, how to farm differently, what it's really about is knowledge. And where does agroecology knowledge come from? In fact, it doesn't come originally from academics and researchers. It comes from the knowledge and practices of smallholder peasant farmers that have been accumulated over thousands of years. Chemicals have only been around for a little bit more than half a century, but before that, people produced food everywhere in the world for millennia. Now, more recently, with the Western sciences like agronomy, ecology, rural sociology, economics, etc., we have what might be called a dialogue among different kinds of knowledge between this accumulated peasant knowledge and these so-called academic sciences like ecology, agronomy, rural sociology, economics, that have somewhat systematized this knowledge on how to farm without poisonous chemicals. The model, though, for agroecology, if the practices come from peasant historical knowledge, the model is nature. And so you see that agroecological systems emulate and coexist with natural ecosystem processes. So you could say that diverse ecological farming is farming with nature, whereas industrial monoculture is a brute force farming against nature. And that's why we're coming up against all of these planetary health and environmental and global warming problems, because we've been trying to farm against nature. Now, I said that agroecology is about knowledge, and that this knowledge comes from peasants. Now, urban people around the world have a lot of prejudices against small farmers and peasants. Urban people tend to think that peasants are ignorant, that they have no education, that they're stupid, and they see a person like this, who we could see from almost anywhere in the world, they think this is an ignorant person. On the other hand, those who study ethno-knowledge and farming practices in agroecology would realize that this man is actually managing all kinds of complex information: ecological interactions, animal behavior, fungi, plants, soils, climate phenomenon, thinking about looking at the sky, what time is it going to rain, how do I need to rearrange the animals, what do I need to plant, what are the market preferences, what are prices, what are the culinary and gastronomic preferences in my household for cooking. It's all kind of complex information, ecophysiology that's being managed all the time, and in fact, small farmers are much better at managing very complex and integrating very complex information all the time than most urban people, who might have quite a hard time surviving in their first year back on the land should they decide to become farmers again. Now, agroecology has some principal characteristics, which is that it applies principles such as diversification, but not recipes. You're not going to do the same diversification in each unique local reality, where you have different climate, different soil, different gastronomy, etc. The only way that you can apply this kind of agroecological principles is by activating farmer knowledge and creativity. But, and this is a big problem, the imposition, the brute force imposition of Green Revolution monoculture by governments around the world on small farmers caused the loss of a lot of farmer knowledge, made farmers lose creativity, made them come to depend on outside knowledge from agronomists and government extension services. So it might be, easy to say, go back to traditional ecological farming, but what if the knowledge, the generational transmission of knowledge was broken by all of this imposition of external knowledge? And it turns out that happened many places in the world. How then can farmers pick up again the principles of agroecology like promoting recycling of biomass, balanced nutrient flows, managing the soil with a high level of soil biology, having closed systems instead of open systems, diversification, enhanced biological interactions and synergisms. Well, what we find in both our academic research and the social movement activism is that social organization of farmers and peasants and social process is key to recovering knowledge and being able to implement knowledge and being able to multiply ecological and agroecological farming. So we have a lot of evidence that agroecology would be better, but do we have the challenge? How do we bring it to scale such that it's practiced by ever more families, ever more peasant families over ever larger territories? And this is the social movement challenge that we're taking on in La Via Campesina as the global farmer movement. And in our academic research, we study successful cases of scaling up or multiplying small farmer agroecology around the world in order to identify the key drivers behind these emblematic success stories. And this information then is for farmer organizations to use when they create their own processes to promote agroecological farming amongst their grassroots membership. Some of the things that we've determined that are key to the success stories are there's been much more agroecological farming success when there's been more social organization, when farmers have been more organized, when there are farmer organizations and social movements. It's required horizontal social process methodology and pedagogies, farmers teaching farmers. It's required that peasants or farmers themselves successful cases when the leadership from outside needs farming practices that work. Nobody's going to multiply an ecological farming practice that doesn't give them sufficient production. Organizations have to have a discourse and a framing that motivates their membership to make a transition. Sometimes it requires a political opportunity like a crisis with the conventional model. COVID could be a political opportunity for agroecology. External allies can be important, charismatic leaders, favorable markets, for example, paying a better price for locally produced ecological food, and favorable public policies can be important as well, depending on the case. On the other hand, although it's great to have favorable public policies, since most governments in the world don't have any or have hardly any or no policies that are favorable to agroecological peasant farming, most of the success stories have been despite public policies, even though, of course, public policies could help. And so that's why it really requires strong social organization and mobilization, because they have to overcome barriers that are created by bad public policies around the world, because governments are beholden to corporate lobbies, and especially agribusiness money in politics, and this is true around the world. So this is a question about public policy. I don't want to go into it now, but it's something that we've been studying. We've been looking into it in Brazil. Andhra Pradesh in India is an interesting case right now of trying to promote agroecological farming through public policy. Mexico, where I live as well. I could say that the shorthand version is Brazil was successful for a while, but then had a change in government, became unsuccessful. Mexico has started to try with a new government, but it looks pretty unsuccessful. Andhra Pradesh looks like it might be a little bit more successful than Brazil and Mexico, and perhaps that's because it's more, although it's a public policy, it's more built on top of social organization in the village level, and we found that social organization is always key. So we say that social organization, or what social movements call organicity, this is the culture medium on which agroecology grows and spreads. Then we need horizontal social process methodology that works on that social organization. So within La Via Campesina, we have a global agroecology process based on horizontal exchanges where farmers teach farmers or learn from farmers. And this includes more than 40 peasant and farmer agroecology schools at the national and international level. Just to take one example from India, this is not just in Via Campesina, it goes way beyond Via Campesina, but the zero budget natural farming movement that started really in Karnataka, but is now spreading to other places, has become public policy in Andhra Pradesh. It's based on farmers rejecting the indebtedness and farmer suicides that result from the conventional model of making farmers dependent on buying seeds, buying chemicals, buying everything, and having farmers use their own local resources in an agroecological way instead, which means that it's called zero budget, because then they don't need to spend money and get in debt to buy the inputs for farming. They use their own resources and knowledge, and it's called natural farming because, as I said before, agroecology is farming with nature instead of farming against nature. And this is something that we've studied. We studied in Karnataka, how more as a grassroots social movement, and now we're starting to look into its institutionalization, which of course can produces opportunities and risks in the case of Andhra Pradesh. And Via Campesino works on international exchanges, so we brought representatives from Asian farmer organizations all over Asia to do exchanges with natural farming farmers in India, and processes have started in Nepal and Sri Lanka and the Philippines and Indonesia as a result of these exchanges. So, but let's go back to this question of knowledge. The Green Revolution was about knowledge imposition, where know-it-all university agronomists imposed the industrial ag monoculture model, in the process crushing peasant knowledge, peasant initiative, peasant protagonism, peasant practices, taking these typical diverse peasant landscapes and turning them into green deserts of industrial monoculture. But it was a knowledge imposition, a colonization, epistemic colonization that took place. And what we see in success stories, I talked about the Karnataka success story, but here's another one from Cuba. A campesino to campesino or peasant to peasant agroecology movement with a methodology, the peasant to peasant methodology, which is the horizontal exchange of knowledge. So if the Green Revolution agronomist knowledge was top-down external imposition, the peasant to peasant, the man with the hat there is a ecological farming peasant who is hosting a workshop on his farm, and other peasants from the surrounding territory are coming to learn from his successful practices. So it's a horizontal exchange instead of a top-down exchange. Instead of outside knowledge, it's peasant knowledge that's already proven to work within the local conditions, which is very important. Very often this outside knowledge was inappropriate and ended up creating social and environmental disasters. That's less likely to happen when it's already successful local knowledge that's being socialized and multiplied. This is something that we've studied also a lot in the case of the Cuba success story. I should say that the success story that started in Karnataka and is now spreading around India, we're talking about millions of farmer families in India. Of course, compared to the total farmer population of India, that's still a very small percentage. Cuba is a much smaller country, but in fact, a much higher proportion of Cuban peasants have now become ecological through this farmer-to-farmer exchange methodology. And there's a key thing: whenever anybody, whether it's a farmer organization itself or outside government agency with a more enlightened approach, or an NGO, or academics, want to encourage farmers to go from chemical monoculture to a more complex agroecological system, what are farmers being asked to do? Are they being asked to change everything at once? To say, okay, tomorrow eliminate everything that you're doing and do something completely different? That creates a psychological barrier, and farmers are going to resist. Anybody resists some kind of a imposition of change like that. And so what we find is the transition or transformation to agroecological farming works much better if it's step by step or bit by bit. And this is the genius of this social methodology of peasant to peasant, because farmers solve their own problems one at a time by learning agroecological solutions from other farmers. So the way it works, if we imagine a village, there might be a couple of families who already have successful agroecological practices. The rest of the families may be doing chemical monocropping, and they may be coming up against problems. Perhaps they have a pest problem that they can't solve because the pest is resistant to chemicals. What the organization will do then is work with one of these ecological farmers who solved this pest problem with an ecological solution. That those farmers will host a workshop, and the organization will invite the farmers who have the problem to visit the farmers who have the solution for hands-on learning on their successful farm how they can solve their problems. So in this methodology, the key pedagogical moment is when those successful ecological peasants offer workshops on their farms to other peasants. So the peasants are the teachers, their farm is their classroom, and it's not an external imposition of knowledge. So traditional knowledge of how to farm and raise animals in the local environment without outside inputs like chemicals and seeds, this was fragmented, atomized, and dispersed amongst community members when outside knowledge was imposed. In order to build now today agroecological peasant territories, we need to find that knowledge, who still has it, recover it and share it from farmer to farmer, make the knowledge whole again at the level of the community, village, or territory. In other words, decolonize knowledge. And that's the purpose of these peasant-to-peasant horizontal methodologies that are being used inside La Via Campesina and social movements around the world. I'm running out of time, so I'm going to move a little bit faster. But I want to show that in Cuba, since the National Farmer Organization, which is part of La Via Campesina, adopted this methodology in a very short time period, about 25 years, from virtually nobody to 50% of all farmer families in the entire country made the transition to ecological farming through this horizontal farmer-to-farmer exchanges based on the social organization of the farmer organization itself. And this has been carried out by the farmer organization, that leadership from the farmer organization itself. One example, here's one family out of thousands or tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands in Cuba, but they took pictures before and after they participated in these exchanges. And this is what their land looked like before. It had been in monoculture production. It was highly degraded, almost no biodiversity, compacted soil, low soil fertility. So we can see 2004, 6 years later, after implementing things they learned from other farmers, we can see how the entire environment of their farm has changed by implementing agroecology and agroforestry systems. And so we see they actually moved from relatively low productivity monoculture to high productivity ecological farming systems. And this is just the visual evidence of what I've already told you of how these ecological systems can be much more productive. I'd like to say that this methodology, through La Via Campesina as a global farmer sharing space, it started originally in Central America. From Central America, it moved to Cuba. From Cuba, through La Via Campesina, it's moved to Africa. It's moved to South America. It's starting to move to Asia. One example were farmer exchanges between Cuba and Mozambique. Another between the landless workers movement in Brazil and Cuba. And within Via Campesina, we've tried to boil it down to a step-by-step way to create this kind of a local process. And then all of this is supplemented by peasant universities and peasant agroecology schools around the world, where peasants teach peasants how to create these processes, how to facilitate these processes, preparing youth to be leadership within farmer organizations in order to build these social processes that are necessary in order for us to move from the food security industrial monoculture model that produces illness, that produces unhealthy food, that produces pandemics, that produces global warming, that produces social devastation and poverty, to more sustainable food sovereignty model based on agroecological farming. I'm just taking a visual tour through some of the farmer training schools and peasant universities within La Via Campesina around the world that focus on this kind of agroecological training and process building. This is in Canada. And so I'll just close then with a slogan of La Via Campesina as a global small farmer and peasant movement, globalize the struggle, globalize hope, and we could say through social organization, globalize peasant agroecology, and the transition from a food security agri-food system to a food sovereignty agri-food system based on small farmers, agrarian reform, and agroecological production. So with that, I'll stop, and we can have some discussion now if people are motivated for questions or comments.
Thank you. Thanks, Peter.
How do I stop sharing? I just need to see how to stop sharing my screen.
I think if you're in.
Yeah, got it. Okay.
All right. So thanks a lot, and I think there's a lot of food for thought. I think the first most important element is to sort of demystify this idea that is, in fact, very widely held, that the industrial corporate agriculture form is, or the green revolution form is, in fact, the most productive way, and so and the fact that it produces the maximum amount of food, or that these methods are highly productive. And I think busting that myth is probably the first most important step in building sort of a greater consensus around ideas of agroecology and the politics of food. But before I say any more, let me sort of open it up for discussion. If there are any questions, anyone wants to ask a question or have a comment, you can also type it in the chat box. I hope it hasn't been muted again. Yes, okay. You can write messages as well. So if anyone wants to type a message or to ask a question, I think there is something in the chat box. Oh no, I thought it was from. Okay. Yeah. Anything from the audience, from students, from some of my colleagues are here. Okay. While they are sort of thinking of their questions and comments, I was wondering, I think one of the stumbling blocks that often comes is the linkage with the market. So while production might be something that might increase, but eventually the place where farmers lose out is precisely the marketability. And maybe that's also one of the attractions for commercial cash crops, which is that there are these established linkages to the market, and so the income that one is able to earn from it is sort of assured to whatever limited extent. So I was wondering sort of where the linkage with market, that question sort of fits into this model.
Yeah, that's a very key question, and I think it's both related to the question of agroecological farming, but it's also related to peasant production in general, or small farmer production in general, and profitability of small farmer production, because we've had a transformation in how people in urban areas acquire food since, let's say, the late 1970s around the world, which we might call the supermarketization of food acquisition. So if we look at the typical kind of products that peasants used to largely supply in urban areas, that we can vegetables and fruits at a global level, before the supermarketization really took off in the, let's say, the 1980s and 90s, 70% of all fresh fruits and vegetables were acquired by urban consumers in street markets, where peasants or intermediaries who buy from peasants were providing the food that was being consumed. As that was inverted, when today it's 70% is acquired in supermarkets and only 30% on street markets, supermarkets exclude peasants, because supermarkets require large-scale production in volume, with specific cosmetic requirements, already washed, refrigerated, turned into their centralized pickup points. And in fact, even though it's for domestic consumption is very similar to export platforms where agri-food corporations produce in one country to export to another with refrigerating, packing plants, and shipping, and that's now become the norm also for domestic consumption through supermarkets. So supermarketization already excluded peasant production, whether it was ecological or non-ecological production. So peasants need to recover access to the market. And here we've got some really big barriers that come from state policy, because many of these supermarket chains violate already existing antitrust, anti-monopoly legislations in most countries around the world, but most countries don't apply their already existing legislation because of corruption, because of money from supermarket chains and the political process. And so it requires social struggle to have monopoly legislation actually applied. It also requires consumer education, but it also requires creating or recreating those alternative marketing channels that were lost with supermarketization. And one of the big struggles of farmer movements around the world is to try to gain access to urban plazas and squares and marketplaces again, and to increase the possibility. And I think that's a place where state policy can help. So, for example, to create peasant or small farmer markets in all neighborhoods and in cities where peasants can recover access to direct sale to consumers that they lost over the supermarketization process. And then it's important that consumers value the more ecological production. So I know, for example, that in Karnataka, which is the epicenter of the natural farming movement in India, the first part of the movement was production at the farm level, but the current part is opening various kinds of ecological food shops and other kinds of alternative markets controlled partially by the farmer movement itself and partially together with urban allies. Now, one of the weaknesses right now, and this could be a self-criticism of the farmer movement globally, is that it's been much easier to put alternative ecological peasant markets in neighborhoods where rich people live and have high purchasing power, and that's not therefore getting healthy food to the majority of the population who live in poor neighborhoods. And so I think it's a challenge, and that's also the majority of the population. If we're talking about building also political alliances to counteract money in politics, then there has to be a majoritarian approach. And I think it's a challenge to farmer movements to try to work to make those alternative food networks, market channels available in poor neighborhoods and not just in middle class and high purchasing power neighborhoods. Over.
Right, thanks. I think we have a question from one of our students. Ritika is writing, hi, big corporate companies such as Microsoft and Crop Data Private are collecting agriculture data under a pilot project to develop a farmer interface. What are your thoughts about its impact on small farmers, if any?
The whole issue of communications and IT technology and agriculture is very important, but I say that there's two contrasting approaches. So the same way that material territory in rural areas are territories in dispute between different models, we can also say that the digital territory is also a territory in dispute. So specifically, if we talk about ecological farming and small farmer or peasant agriculture, on the one hand, we see, if we take the India example, the Karnataka example, many of the farmer-to-farmer exchanges, the kinds that are taking place in Cuba, physically visiting another farm because of larger distances in India, a lot of them are taking place through farmers creating Instagram groups, Facebook groups, WhatsApp groups, making their own videos on their different practices to teach other farmers with their cell phone. And so there's a huge advance of peasant agroecology, small farmer agroecology using digital methodology, and so that's definitely positive. On the other hand, what Microsoft and other corporations are trying to do, which they call Agriculture 4.0, is to create an integration between producers of large size farm machinery like John Deere and Caterpillar, producers of chemical fertilizers, producers of pesticides like Bayer, Monsanto, ChemChina, and others, and collect data from every farm at a very micro level and make that data available to the sales staff for the farm machinery, irrigation equipment, chemicals, fertilizer, poisons, GMO seeds, so that they can do targeted marketing to farmers and make farmers way more dependent upon all of those destructive, expensive, unsustainable technologies. And so the agriculture 4.0 that Microsoft and others are pushing is to create a much stronger corporate alliance to deepen the unsustainable corporate agri-food system. And on the other hand, we have the Via Campesina and farm organizations also using digital methodologies, technologies, but to advance the opposite, which is small farmer ecological production. So it's an arena of dispute. Over.
Yeah, thanks.
I would like to add one more thing, which is that because there's a lot of IT in Karnataka and a lot of disillusioned IT engineers and software programmers, many of them are dropping out and becoming very key allies to the agroecology farmers movement, whether it's opening farmer shops, whether it's helping to create the social networks for farmer exchanges, whether it's actually becoming farmers themselves. It's really quite an amazing. It's obviously not the majority of IT corporate staff, but it's been a significant source of allies to the farmer and the agroecology movement. Over.
Right. Are there any other questions or any comments anyone has? Okay, if they are and if everyone's thinking, I was wondering if you could also, Tulika, you have a question?
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. Hello, sir, and it's a pleasure meeting you. And I have actually, okay, let me introduce myself first. I'm a final year PhD researcher in IIT Guwahati, and my thesis topic is based on the framework of food sovereignty. So I'm basically working on engagement of women farmers in local food system in two states of India, that is Odisha and Nagaland. So I've just completed field work. So my question to you is, the state of Odisha, what I have seen is there's a government model which is encouraging local farmers to cultivate more of millet crop, which is an indigenous crop, and which has lost its diversity and which has lost its relevance owing to the green revolution and the promotion of rice and wheat because of the green revolution phenomena. So what the government is doing there is they are trying to revive this millet crop and they are trying to put it back on the farms and on the plate. So my question to you is, where do you see the role of the state in this food sovereignty framework and in this movement? Can we see the role of the state in a positive way, or how do you see the role? And the second question is, do you think that small farmers with small land holdings and all, do you think that they really exercise their choice in going for diversification of crops, or what I basically mean to say is, do they really have a choice in either going for going for food crop cultivation or cash crop cultivation? So what's your opinion on that?
Well, those are very good questions, and I'm really glad to hear your thesis topic. That sounds very important, and I'd love to read whatever comes out of that. But in the meantime, the question of the role of the state between the food sovereignty and food security model, the corporate model, the peasant model, the chemical intensive versus the agroecology model, it's very complex. And I would say that that one thing that we can unequivocally ask the state to do, or pressure the state to do, because the state doesn't do these things if we don't mobilize a lot of pressure on them, is to stop the myriad different ways in which the state openly and in hidden ways subsidizes the corporate food system. So in other words, get the money that normal people pay in taxes through the government, get that out of corporate subsidies. That's one thing. So one of the big advantages that the corporate food system has is that it has unbelievable amount of government money that goes in open and hidden ways to it. Number two, governments should apply the precautionary principle and ban toxic pesticides, ban GMOs. Number three, government should actually apply anti-monopoly, antitrust legislation on food industry corporations. Number four, public universities should stop teaching the Green Revolution model as the dominant thing taught in agronomy faculties of universities. So in other words, we need government to stop doing all of the bad things that it does, which props up an unsustainable corporate food system. Then the question is, can government not only stop doing bad things, but could it actually do some good things? And this is where it gets a little bit more complicated, because we really find that the success stories depend on local leadership and local mobilization. And sometimes if you have heavy-handed government policies, even if you might say they're well-intentioned, sometimes they end up suffocating local initiative and local mobilization and creating a new dependence. Instead of dependence on government for green revolution technology, dependence on government for alternative technology. So it doesn't mean that we can't have good policies, but it means that it's not a black and white situation. It's a very fine-grained way that we have to look at it. So can we imagine government policies that don't stifle local initiative? Well, I mentioned one before, creating farmers market plazas in all urban neighborhoods in all cities, for example. On the other hand, that could open the way to political corruption, where local politicians could control through clientelistic networks access to the sale points and distort what could be a good policy. So we see this problem comes in anytime we have government policy, even a good policy, we find that politicians, political parties, corruption, money can easily end up distorting the policy. So I think it's good when governments say, okay, we're going to promote the recovery of lost crops that could be important for biodiversity, important for nutrition, important for farmer livelihoods. But it's much better if governments support farmer organizations themselves rather than trying to supplant or suffocate farmer organizations. And we, as activists, whether in the farmer movement, the consumer movement, the environmental movement, have to be very vigilant and mobilized, because otherwise it slips into corruption and clientelistic networks of political control and vote buying as opposed to real change. So it's very delicate. So that was the first question on the state. Remind me quickly the second question. I just forgot.
Okay, yeah. The second question was, what do you think that do small farmers really have a choice in terms of either going for,
Choice is a difficult question, because when we think about all the ways that everybody, including small farmers, have been brainwashed with the myths of the dominant model, whether it's radio advertising, television advertising, billboards, government subsidies, free samples, extension agents telling you to do it. The whole system is telling you to do the industrial monoculture model, and so minds have been colonized, and that's why we need methodologies like farmer to farmer, peasant to peasant, which very subtly move farmers towards a more sustainable approach by actually allowing them to solve the problems that they still have, and then bit by bit they get out of the dominant model. Because the ideology, the corporate ideology, is so pervasive in our capitalist system that really the concept of choice is a non-concept. If you've been brainwashed, what does choice mean? It doesn't really mean anything. But as a farmer organization that understands the reason why we have growing poverty, the reason why we have growing indebtedness of farmers, the reason why we have ever more farmer suicides, the reason why we have deforestation, the reason why we have global warming, the reason why we have diabetes epidemic around the world from bad food, that requires a process to transition to a different to a different kind of a food system, then the farmer organizations can decide we are going to create a process, an educational process internally to counteract this pervasive brainwashing and create processes to ease a transition to something else. So I guess my answer to the question is I think choice doesn't exist, or it's a non-concept because we live in a society of corporate brainwashing. But organizations, social movements, farmer organizations, consumer organizations, environmental organizations, human rights organizations can make decisions to create educational processes to actually counteract the effects of brainwashing. Over.
Thank you, sir.
Thanks. Thanks, Peter. Any other questions from anyone else? Or any comments? Okay. I was just wondering, since no one is asking, so I'm going to take the liberty of going at it again. But, one, I thought that something that you pointed out to, which was quite important again, is the relevance of social and political struggles in this entire process, right? That there isn't sort of a straightforward formula or solution or a model. An agroecology also isn't that model that you simply say we found it and now you can implement it there, but eventually it all sort of is based on social organization and political struggles. So just in that context, and since you're based in Mexico, I mean, you spoke of how, out of Brazil, Mexico, and the Andhra Pradesh experience in India, that Mexico was, you mentioned less of a success right now. Right? So I was just wondering if you could say just a little bit in terms of, what is the state of the farmers' movement of Via Campesina in terms of the level of social organization and their ability to mobilize around certain kinds of ideas.
Yes, well, I think it's an interesting comparison, Andhra Pradesh and Mexico, because the current governments, in the case of Andhra Pradesh, state level, in the case of Mexico, federal, national level government, each have a very large. They don't use the word agroecology in either case, but what we could call very large agroecology policies, and I believe they're the two largest in the world right now, or perhaps the two largest in the history of the world, either in terms of the number of farmers being approached or in terms of the actual area being impacted of farmland. And both of them are incipient, so it's too early to make a final conclusion, but I would say that I'm much more concerned about the Mexican model than the Andhra Pradesh model. And I mentioned one of the key things that I believe is enlightened in the case of Andhra Pradesh is that already existing social organization, and it's interesting that the previous question was from someone who was studying the role of women, because the already existing social organization that's the framework in Andhra Pradesh are women's groups previously organized at the village level, and it's women peasants taking the leadership as the support for this public policy that's reaching out to so many millions of farm families and so many millions of hectares. And so it's government policy supporting social organization. In the case of Mexico, which like India has very rich social organization at the village and rural level, but the government policy is working against that social organization instead of building upon it. And so the current government, even though it's presented to the world as progressive, but I would say in fact is really quite neoliberal, instead of working with that rich social organization, has canceled any previously existing policy that supported organized groups and has individualized all government cash transfer, extension, everything. All policy is now at the individual level, and so what it does is it completely undercuts all social organization, whether farm organization, village organization, community organization, indigenous people organization, farmer cooperative, everything like that is being undercut, and then they're trying to do agroecology by paying farmers to do it, which is always a mistake, because then when the money runs out, they stop doing it, as opposed to convincing farmers to do it, or farmers convincing themselves that they want to do it through their own social process, and then having hiring poorly trained agronomists to tell farmers what to do when clearly the farmers know that these are idiots who know nothing about farming, who just came out of the university, and then having bureaucrats in the capital of the country design farming systems for people in remote mountainous or lowland rainforest or desertic areas and sending the wrong crop varieties, the wrong tree seedlings, the wrong planting designs for local realities. So it's like everything you could possibly do wrong in one policy. And so if you assume that the purpose of the policy is to actually do agroecology, then you would say everything's wrong. But in fact, the real purpose is to buy votes by paying farmers money every month on a plastic card and breaking down their allegiance to any previous existing organization and making them into electoral clientele for the current governing party. And when the elections come around, they're going to say, oh, but if the other party wins, maybe you'll lose your monthly cash transfer. And so better not risk voting for somebody else. And so it's and this is when I say that government policy for agroecology or different food system is very dangerous because in any country, it can easily slip into clientelism, vote buying, corruption. And this is what we seem to be seeing in the case of the Mexico policy. And what I'm hoping, and I obviously don't live in Andhra Pradesh, but from what I hear, I'm hoping that some of the worst excesses of the Mexican model are being avoided in the Andhra Pradesh model. But I will say that I'm concerned about it. And one of the articles that I showed you was the challenges from Inception to institutionalization. A large part of the big success in Karnataka was grassroots farmer mobilization. Now when the state does it, will farmers mobilize or will they become passive? And if they become passive, then that automatically limits the velocity at which change can move across territories. So we'll see. It's an open question, but I'm more hopeful in the Andhra Pradesh case. Over.
All right, thanks. Yeah, no, thanks, because that also gives us a better sense of, also with the, like you said, that the new government in Mexico, there's a lot of hope thinking that it is sort of a more popular and progressive government. Yeah, well, so nearly out of time, but if there are any other last comments or questions that anyone would like to ask, if not, then we'll sort of wrap up. So if there's anything that anyone still wants to.
If not, I could make a few final comments.
Yeah, sure.
So what I'd like to say, I guess, then to wrap up is that we should think about the COVID pandemic and how, on the one hand, it's very likely that the virus itself came from the industrial food system. Number two, if we look at who dies from COVID, it's people who have comorbidity factors, and almost all of the comorbidity factors come from industrial food, whether it's obesity, diabetes, heart disease, hypertension, certain forms of food and chemical residue in food related cancers. So it creates the pandemics just like it did swine flu and avian flu. It makes us more likely to die from them. During the pandemic, the industrial food chains, commodity chains broke down in many cases because they were relying on very long distance transport, and with lockdowns and social distancing and everything, we had barren supermarket shelves even in places like the United States. And so this system also showed itself to be incapable of delivering food on time as needed under emergency conditions. And what we saw were many people going back to local peasant markets in order to acquire food when the industrial food system couldn't deliver food under the conditions of the crisis that it itself created. And so I think that we need to seize, we as farmers, we as consumers, we as environmentalists, we as health activists, we as human rights activists, whatever it is, we human beings, the 99% and not the 1%, need to take the pandemic as a political opportunity, a pedagogical moment, and we need to be talking to society about all of the problems of the corporate industrial monopoly food system and the hope of the alternatives, and we need to obviously create the conditions for the social struggle that would be the only possible way to transit from the corporate system that's creating almost all of the major problems we're facing today as humanity and as planet Earth, to transit to something that's more sustainable and more socially just. So I will just close with that. But let's think about all of this in the light of the COVID-19 pandemic. And so thank you so much for the invitation to join you.
Thanks a lot for those comments as well. I think, yeah, those were important comments also to connect up with so much else that maybe we wouldn't think of, sort of the relationship between the importance of the politics of food and the way in which the pandemic affects us. So, I think the interconnections are important to sort of draw out, and like you said, to think of this as, as a political opportunity. Thanks a lot for those comments, and thanks so much for joining us. I know you're sort of moving and a lot is going on, so it was really nice that, despite the time schedules and all of that, you were able to join us, and we hope to be in touch.
Well, thank you so much for the invitation, and I'll sign off now, but thank you to everybody. Bye-bye.
Thanks. Yeah, and thank you to Anindu for all the technical parts. Yeah.